Prologue, The Silent Return. It always begins quietly, not with the sound of breaking glass or the slamming of doors, but with a tremor in the air, a heaviness that children learn to recognize before they understand it. Behind one door, two voices rise and fall, sharp enough to slice through the stillness. Behind another, laughter stops mid-sentence. The cousins pause their game. No one tells them what's happening, but they already know. They wait, not for the shouting to end, but for the silence that comes after. The kind that makes even the walls hold their breath. Then, without speaking, they begin to move. One gathers the scattered toys. Another folds the blanket. Someone returns a borrowed book to its shelf. The small room, once chaotic with play, becomes unnaturally tidy, as if the children are trying to erase the evidence that joy once existed here. No one instructed them. No one said, "Clean up." Yet they do, instinctively, collectively, silently. And in that quiet act, something ancient stirs. Because this isn't just a scene from childhood, it's a pattern, a truth, a mirror of something far greater than a family dispute. When those who hold power, the ones we depend on, the ones we fear disappointing, begin to clash, those beneath them do not fight back. They retreat into order. They return what doesn't belong to them. They tidy their small corners of the world, hoping the restoration of neatness might restore a sense of safety. Every generation knows this feeling. When parents fight, cousins return everything. When leaders argue, citizens withdraw. When gods wage wars, believers tighten their rituals. The world has seen this choreography again and again, power colliding at the top, quiet submission below. Empires rise and crumble, families fracture, and ordinary people respond with the same ancient reflex: control what you can when everything else falls apart. But maybe there's something more profound in that gesture. Maybe in the act of returning, we reveal our deepest longing to belong, to feel harmony, to believe that balance can be rebuilt through order. Still, a question lingers in the silence. Why do we clean when the world breaks? Why do we return things when we should be asking why they were taken in the first place? Perhaps we are not just tidying rooms. Perhaps we are tidying reality, trying to make sense of the chaos that authority leaves behind. Because this story isn't just about parents or cousins or houses filled with echoes. It's about something older than all of them. The way power and fear ripple through human life, shaping our smallest gestures and our grandest histories. And maybe this isn't about families at all. Maybe it's about what happens every time the powerful fight and the powerless, quietly, clean up their mess. The family as the first system. Before we ever learn the rules of nations, markets, or religions, we learn the rules of the home. The family is humanity's first government, its first school, its first stage. Every law, every border, every ritual of civilization begins here, in the small, unspoken politics of living rooms and dining tables. In a home, power isn't theoretical. It's emotional. It breathes. It scolds. It hugs. It withdraws. A child doesn't study authority. They feel it in the tone of a parent's voice, in who gets the last word, in who apologizes first. Before a child learns history, they live it, their own small version of it. And it's there, in these miniature kingdoms, that we first understand hierarchy. The parent becomes ruler. The rules become laws. Fairness becomes negotiable, depending on who holds control. One sibling becomes the diplomat, another the rebel, another the invisible one who survives by being quiet. Every role mirrors a future one: the worker, the citizen, the subject. Psychologists like John Bowlby called this our attachment blueprint. It's the pattern through which we interpret every future relationship, not just with people, but with systems. If a parent's love was conditional, the world becomes conditional. If safety required obedience, authority becomes sacred. If love required silence, truth becomes dangerous. That's why the family is not just a private space. It's the rehearsal room of civilization. Every argument, every compromise, every act of control teaches the child what power feels like. And when that power collapses, when parents fight, the entire system trembles. The child does not analyze, they adapt. They shrink their world until it feels predictable again. They pick up toys, they return borrowed things, they rebuild order in miniature, a tiny, desperate simulation of peace. Philosopher Erich Fromm once wrote that man is born helpless into a world that must be tamed through obedience. In the home, obedience begins not with law, but with fear. The fear of losing love, of losing the fragile stability that holds the world together. So the child learns the oldest survival strategy in human history: appease power to survive its storms. Years later, that same psychology scales up. Citizens tidy their beliefs when governments fall. Workers go silent when corporations feud. Followers retreat when ideologies clash. It's not just mimicry, it's conditioning. We carry the emotional architecture of our families into every structure we build. The family teaches us that conflict above means danger below. That when the parents, leaders, systems, ideologies begin to fight, our job is not to question, but to return everything. To undo, to retreat, to disappear behind order. But maybe what we call order is just our most sophisticated form of fear, a reflex passed down from dinner tables to parliaments, from households to nations. Because before we ever obeyed kings or gods, we obeyed the trembling silence after our parents' voices broke. The air. And that silence became sacred. It became the blueprint for peace, not peace through understanding, but peace through compliance. So when we talk about power, we are not talking about politics. We are talking about the memory of home, about how the smallest emotional economies, guilt, loyalty, affection, punishment, become the currency of entire civilizations. Every time we flinch before authority, we are remembering something ancient. Every time we choose order over truth, we are replaying a family drama written long before we were born. The family, then, is not just where we come from. It's where the world first learns to rule itself. Inherited wars, history's family feuds. If the family is the first system, then history is simply the echo of its quarrels, stretched across centuries, magnified through bloodlines, ideologies, and borders. Humanity never outgrew the family. It merely expanded it. What were empires, if not parents demanding loyalty? What were revolutions, if not children shouting that they've had enough? Every nation, every movement, every holy war, a reenactment of something intimate and ancient. You can see it in the chronicles of every civilization. When kings quarreled, the peasants tightened their belts. When dynasties feuded, cities turned to ash. When nations fought, ordinary people, the world's cousins, quietly began returning things: land, hope, trust. They retreated into survival. After every great conflict, the story repeats. The First World War ends, and soldiers come home to rebuild fences, paint doors, and replant fields, returning to order after a global argument that shattered meaning. The Second World War ends, and Europe divides the house. This side yours, this side mine, as if the planet itself is a broken family trying to live separately under the same roof. The Soviet Union collapses, and countries rush to reclaim old identities, old names, old flags, each one returning what was borrowed: trying to remember who they were before the argument began. History is full of these returns. They look political, but they are deeply psychological. When power collapses, the powerless don't reach for revolution first. They reach for familiarity. They clean the wreckage. They reestablish names. They cling to symbols that feel like home. It's the same impulse that drives the cousins to put the toys back after a family fight. The belief that by returning what once belonged, peace will somehow follow. But the peace that follows is often fragile, deceptive. Because what history calls reconstruction is usually just a silence between storms, a fragile truce between forces that have not yet learned to listen. Like children who grow up promising they'll never argue like their parents, only to become those parents one day. The historian Arnold Toynbee described civilizations as organisms that rise, break, and rebuild through cycles of challenge and response. But what if the real challenge isn't external? What if the real inheritance we keep passing down is not technology or territory, but unresolved emotion, the shame of defeat, the pride of power, the unspoken belief that control is safer than conversation, because families don't just pass on their names, they pass on their ways of avoiding pain. And nations are no different. When one generation avoids its confrontation, the next inherits its silence. When one empire refuses reflection, another is born in its image. And so, the world keeps replaying the same domestic scene, only on a grander stage. The same fear, the same hierarchy, the same instinct to clean up rather than change. Look closely, and you'll see the pattern. Ancient Rome, exhausted from civil war, retreats into empire, tidying chaos with authoritarian order. Post-war Japan, humbled and broken, rebuilds with quiet precision, restoring discipline where identity once fractured. Modern nations, after ideological collapse, rebrand and reorganize, painting new faces over old wounds. The fight changes costumes. The cousins return the toys. The world moves on. But something is always lost in that return. A truth left unspoken. A question left unanswered. We rebuild the walls, but never ask why they keep falling. We mourn the ashes, but never ask who set the fire. Maybe history isn't a line moving forward, but a family argument stretched across generations, paused, resumed, forgotten, but never resolved. And if that's true, then every border, every treaty, every flag is just another form of tidying, another attempt to restore order after chaos without confronting the chaos itself. Because humanity, for all its progress, still behaves like a house where the parents are fighting, and the cousins, terrified of losing the home entirely, keep returning everything. The psychology of return, why humans retreat into order, what truly happens inside the human mind when chaos erupts above us. Why do we not fight, not flee, but return to order, to silence, to tidiness? The answer lies deep within the architecture of the brain, buried in its most ancient circuits. When uncertainty floods our environment, our nervous system enters crisis mode. It scans for control, for anything predictable, anything repeatable. Psychologists call it predictive regulation, the body's way of maintaining emotional stability when reality becomes unstable. Children living through conflict learn this early. When the adults fight, they can't change the outcome, so they regulate the only environment they can touch: the room, the toys, themselves. They return borrowed things because control, even symbolic, brings temporary safety. This behavior doesn't vanish with age, it evolves. Adults do the same thing with rituals, habits, and systems. After collective trauma, societies build bureaucracies. After emotional pain, individuals create routines. The brain's goal is not truth, It's survival. It doesn't ask, what's right? It asks, what can I control? When nations collapse, people cling to flags. When faith falters, people cling to rules. When love ends, people clean their houses. It's not logic, it's neurology. In moments of chaos, order becomes our substitute for safety. But there's another layer to this, one less biological, more existential. Cognitive dissonance, the tension between belief and reality, drives us toward reconciliation, even if that reconciliation is false. When what we feel and what we see no longer align, the mind can't stand the noise. So we create rituals of return, gestures of symbolic control that tell the self, everything is fine. That's why silence feels like peace, even when it's repression. That's why conformity feels like security, even when it's imprisonment. We would rather tidy the surface than confront the depth. Consider this. A child picks up a broken vase after an argument, carefully aligning the shards on the table. They don't glue it. They don't ask who broke it. They just arrange the fragments into something resembling order. The brain does the same thing after every emotional catastrophe. It organizes the pieces, not to repair, but to pretend nothing happened. This is the essence of the return. It's not restoration, it's retreat. A psychological choreography that repeats in every layer of human life. Neuroscience calls it the homeostatic loop, the tendency of living systems to restore equilibrium after disruption. Philosophy calls it denial, the refusal to acknowledge the truth that change has already occurred. History calls it recovery, though often it's just collective amnesia dressed as progress. The tragedy is that this reflex, while protective, becomes self-destructive when it replaces understanding with avoidance. The same instinct that shields a child from trauma prevents an adult society from transformation. We tidy pain instead of processing it. We rebuild without reflection. We move on without healing. And so, the emotional architecture of humanity remains the same, a vertical structure of chaos at the top and compliance below. When the parents, the authorities, the institutions, the powers fight, we instinctively tidy the space they disturb, hoping order will return us to safety. But the irony is profound. In trying to restore control, we often surrender it completely. Because true control is not in returning what's broken, it's in understanding why it broke. Philosopher Carl Jung wrote that what is not made conscious returns as fate. The unspoken emotion, the unresolved pattern, the buried tension, all of it resurfaces, not as memory, but as repetition. Humanity repeats what it refuses to confront. So every time we return everything, we're also resetting the stage for it all to happen again. We mistake neatness for healing. We confuse stillness with peace. And we forget that silence is not the opposite of noise. It's just noise turned inward. The psychology of return, then, is both beautiful and tragic. It shows our longing for harmony, our desperate need for coherence. But it also reveals our greatest illusion, that by putting things back where they were, we can undo what has already changed. The truth is, we can't. And maybe we were never supposed to. Modern parallels, the digital family feud. If history repeats the family, then the modern world broadcasts it. Today, our conflicts no longer echo through hallways. They stream through screens. The family dinner table has expanded into a digital theater, where billions gather not to eat, but to watch the arguments unfold. Parents have become influencers, politicians, institutions, each claiming authority, each shouting louder to be heard. And the cousins, the ordinary people caught in between, they scroll, they watch, they react, then they do what they've always done. They return everything. Only now, the return looks different. Unfollowing, deleting, muting, logging off, modern withdrawal disguised as autonomy. When the digital parents, the leaders, the creators, the tribes begin to fight, the algorithm amplifies the noise. Each side demands loyalty. Each claims moral superiority. Each promises safety, belonging, identity. And just like children raised in conflict, we learn to survive by silence or imitation. We pick sides to feel safe. We echo opinions to feel seen. We tidy our digital rooms, our feeds, our histories, to project the illusion of order. Social media is no longer a marketplace of ideas. It's a family feud turned spectacle, a cycle of outrage and withdrawal, performance and retreat. The moment disagreement becomes discomfort, we return our attention, our empathy, our curiosity. We delete nuance the way frightened children hide broken toys. And behind it all lies the same primitive impulse. When power becomes unpredictable, reduce exposure. Our nervous systems were never designed for this scale of emotional volatility. The tribal brain, evolved for small circles and familiar faces, now confronts a global village of perpetual shouting. The result? Collective fatigue. The digital equivalent of children covering their ears. We mistake disconnection for peace. We call withdrawal boundaries. We call silence self-care. And sometimes it is, but often it's the same inherited reflex of avoidance, the modern version of returning everything. When influencers fall from grace, audiences retreat into moral purity. When ideologies clash, we hide behind irony and detachment. When truth becomes uncomfortable, we flood it with entertainment until the silence feels bearable again. It's easy to see this pattern as progress, as self-protection in a noisy age. But underneath, the emotional choreography remains unchanged. We are still the cousins, still tidying after conflict, only now the toys are opinions and the room is the internet. And the parents? They are no longer just human. They are algorithms, unseen, calculating, endlessly feeding the conflict that keeps us watching. They understand our reflex better than we do. They know we crave order after chaos, predictability after outrage. So they serve us what feels tidy, filtered content, familiar views, digital comfort. It's a perfect system. Chaos sells, withdrawal sustains. Conflict generates engagement. Disengagement resets the stage. And every cycle reinforces the same ancient structure of power and fear. We may believe we've evolved beyond the family, beyond the emotional dependencies of childhood. But our behaviors betray us. We still seek parents in presidents, prophets, and public figures. We still measure safety by belonging. We still tidy our virtual spaces to convince ourselves that we are in control. The modern world didn't erase the family dynamic, it digitized it, and every online feud, every culture war, every viral us versus them moment is just another replay of the same scene. Two powerful forces clashing while the rest of us quietly log off, pretending it never happened. The difference now is that the fight never ends. There's no door to close, no silence that lasts. The conflict loops endlessly, and we, caught between fatigue and fear, perform our small rituals of control, unfollow, delete, retreat. But as with every generation before us, the cost remains the same. Each time we return everything, we also return ourselves, a little more detached, a little less human, a little more convinced that safety lives in silence. The cost of emotional inheritance. What do we inherit when we grow up in the ruins of other people's wars? Not their victories, not their wisdom, but their silences, the unspoken rules, the quiet fears, the reflex to tidy what breaks rather than ask why it broke. This is the cost of emotional inheritance. learning to mistake avoidance for peace. Every family, every society carries a ledger of unprocessed pain. It doesn't appear in textbooks or wills, but in mannerisms, in tones of voice, in the instinct to withdraw when tension rises. These debts pass invisibly, from parent to child, from generation to generation, like unseen fingerprints on every decision we make. A child raised in a house where anger meant danger learns to equate calm with safety. A generation raised under unstable governments learns to equate obedience with survival. And so, silence becomes virtue. Stillness becomes strength. Returning everything becomes a ritual of protection. But what happens when a ritual of protection becomes a system of repression? When every generation keeps cleaning instead of confronting, the original wound never heals. It just hides. The emotions we bury do not disappear. They crystallize into institutions, ideologies, and collective behavior. Psychologists studying intergenerational trauma call this emotional encoding. Pain mutates into posture. Fear becomes caution. Shame becomes tradition. And what we call our culture is often just our collective coping mechanism, a polished mask inherited from those who were too afraid to speak. Philosopher Viktor Frankl once wrote that between stimulus and response lies a space, and in that space lies our freedom. But most of us never reach it. We live inside the reflex, reacting to the past without realizing it. We follow inherited scripts written by the frightened, the silenced, the survivors. The cost of emotional inheritance is subtle but devastating. We learn to love cautiously, to think quietly, to dream within approved boundaries. We suppress conflict in the name of harmony, not knowing that harmony born of fear is only another kind of chaos. Whole civilizations have lived this way, defining stability as the absence of visible disorder. But beneath the surface, pressure builds, unspoken grievances fester. The family that never argues becomes the one that explodes without warning. The nation that avoids confrontation becomes the one that collapses overnight. Silence may look like peace, but it is only peace for those who fear truth. Every generation inherits a choice: to return what was borrowed or to confront what was broken. Most choose the first because it feels safer. But safety built on denial is temporary. It's the safety of walking through a minefield carefully, never knowing when the past will detonate beneath your feet. And perhaps that's why humanity feels perpetually haunted by history, by trauma, by patterns we swear we've escaped but somehow keep repeating. We think time erases what it doesn't resolve. It doesn't. Time merely teaches it new disguises. We inherit silence not through genes, but through imitation, through the behaviors we never question, through the comfort we find in pretending that everything returned to its place means everything is fine. But deep down, we know the truth. The toys may be back on the shelf. The room may be quiet again, yet the air still trembles with everything unsaid. And until we find the courage to break that silence, we will keep returning everything and losing ourselves in the process. Epilogue: the rebirth of the unreturned self. There comes a moment when the room no longer echoes with the past, when the silence after the fight doesn't feel like peace, but like absence. When you realize that tidying what's broken doesn't make it whole. The cousins have grown up now. The toys are gone. The house has aged. But somewhere deep within them, the reflex remains. That quiet urge to return, to restore, to erase the evidence of disruption. It lingers not as memory, but as instinct. And yet, one day, something shifts. One of them stops mid-motion, holding a borrowed book, a small, forgotten relic of that childhood ritual, and simply doesn't return it. Not out of rebellion, but out of awakening, out of understanding that not everything borrowed needs to be given back, that some things, when kept, become transformation. Because healing begins where the cycle ends, when we stop performing tidiness and start confronting truth, when we let the vase remain broken, not as a sign of failure, but as a reminder of what fragility teaches. Every family, every society, every human being reaches this threshold, the moment when the old reflexes stop working. The rituals that once kept us safe now keep us small. To move beyond them, we must question the silence we once worshipped. Maybe the opposite of returning everything is not rebellion, but ownership, the courage to hold the mess and still call it ours. To stop fearing the noise, the argument, the discomfort, because these too are signs of life. The great illusion of humanity has always been that peace equals order. But peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of understanding. And understanding can only bloom when we dare to speak into the quiet, when we refuse to keep returning what was never truly ours to begin with, the guilt, the fear, the inherited restraint. Every system, every generation, every self must eventually confront this choice. To keep reenacting the old family drama, power versus submission, chaos versus order, or to step outside the script entirely. Those who choose the latter begin the long, uncomfortable work of becoming unreturned. They stop cleaning up other people's messes. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop mistaking silence for safety. And in doing so, they rediscover something extraordinary. The world doesn't end when we stop obeying fear. The house doesn't collapse when we leave things undone. The noise doesn't destroy us, it frees us. Maybe this is what rebirth really is. Not a grand enlightenment, not a final answer, but the simple act of holding on to what we once gave away too easily: our voice, our will, our presence. So when the next fight begins, when the systems clash, when the voices rise, when the powerful collide, maybe this time we don't tidy the room. Maybe we sit with the noise. Maybe we ask the question no one ever asked: why must we return anything at all? Because perhaps the only way to end the inherited cycle of fear is to keep something unreturned, something that belongs entirely to us. Not the silence, not the obedience, but the self that refused to disappear. And maybe, just maybe, that's where all healing begins, when we finally stop returning everything and start living what was never theirs to take.